A patient vanished from this hospital in 1990, and for 34 years, no one knew what happened to them. That mystery came crashing back on a Tuesday morning in March of 2024, when workers renovating the old hospital struck a wall that was never meant to be opened. It was supposed to be routine, a job like any other. The hospital, a sprawling brick giant that had stood for nearly a century, was being gutted, remodeled, and transformed into something brighter, shinier, cleaner. The East Wing, long abandoned, its windows cracked, its hallways sagging under the weight of time, was next on the list. For weeks, construction crews had been hammering away at plaster, hauling out debris, and stripping wires from ceilings that hadn't seen light in decades. They joked as they worked, their radios blasting classic rock that echoed eerily in the empty corridors. The place was filthy, sure, but not unusual, just another old building being reborn. But that morning, something felt different. The air in the East Wing was heavier than usual, thick with dust stirred up by demolition. The smell of mildew and rot clung to the back of the workers' throats. As one crew member swung his sledgehammer into a section of wall, he felt a hollow vibration beneath the plaster, not the solid thud of brick, something empty. "Hey, listen to this," he called, striking again. The wall cracked, the sound echoing strangely, as though there was space behind it. When the plaster began to crumble, the faint outline of a doorway appeared. The men stopped, lowered their tools, stared. No one had seen this on the blueprints. No one had been told about a door. The foreman stepped forward, brushing his glove over the frame. Paint peeled away in long strips, like old scabs being picked. The wood was scarred, warped from years of dampness, but still unmistakably a door. "Get the crowbar," he said. It took effort. The hinges screamed in protest, metal grinding against metal as rust gave way. When the door finally gave, it released a sound so deep, so unnatural, that several men instinctively stepped back. Then came the smell. It rolled out in a wave-stale air, thick with dust, mildew, and something sour, something that clung to the skin, something that smelled like time had been rotting in there. The men lifted their flashlights, beams slicing through the darkness. What they saw stopped them cold. Beyond the doorway stretched a corridor, narrow, windowless, lined with doors on both sides. Each one was heavy, fitted with locks from the outside. The paint had bubbled, cracked, peeled into strange patterns. They had found a hallway, a ward, a forgotten one. The workers exchanged looks, their earlier bravado gone. They stepped cautiously inside, boots crunching on shattered tile and glass. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of their footsteps. Dust swirled in the beams of their flashlights like ash. Somewhere deep in the building, a pipe groaned, the sound traveling like a whisper through the walls. The first room they checked held a bed frame, its metal rusted, its leather restraints dangling like brittle snakes. The straps cracked and flaked when touched, as though they'd been waiting decades for wrists that never came back. In another room, a wheelchair sat abandoned in the corner, one wheel bent at an unnatural angle. An old clipboard still clung to a hook on the wall, its paper yellowed, its ink faded to nothing more than faint scratches. On the walls, there were marks, some shallow, some deep, scratches carved into plaster. Were they from furniture, from time, or from fingernails, desperate and clawing? One man muttered, "We shouldn't be here." But curiosity or maybe dread pushed them further. At the end of the corridor stood a door, unlike the others, heavier, sealed with bolts on the outside. They pried it open, the metal screaming as if protesting the act. What they saw inside made their blood run cold. A small patient room, empty, except for a metal bed frame against the wall, a folded hospital gown, and a blanket. And in the corner, slumped against the plaster, brittle and collapsed, the unmistakable remains of a human being. Bones, pale, fragile, wrapped in the tattered remnants of a hospital gown. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of their flashlights and the pounding of their hearts. Then the foreman whispered, almost reverently, "Jesus Christ." The crew stumbled back into the hallway, their flashlights trembling. Some gagged against the stench, others simply stared at the dark, trying to process what they'd just uncovered. The foreman's hands shook as he dialed 911. "Dispatch, this is construction at County General. We've found," his voice faltered, "we've found human remains." Within the hour, The site was flooded. Police cars circled the hospital, their lights casting red and blue against the crumbling brick. Yellow tape cordoned off the east wing. Investigators in gloves and masks stepped cautiously into the sealed corridor, their voices low and grim. By evening, news had spread. Human remains found behind sealed wall in abandoned hospital wing. The headline hit every local station, every paper, every radio broadcast. And with it came the whispers, the memories of a case long thought forgotten. Because back in 1990, a patient had mysteriously vanished from this very hospital. Her name was Sarah Whitfield. She had been only 27 years old. One moment she was here, the next she was gone. Her case had haunted the town for years, then faded into the background, a ghost of the past. But now, after 34 years of silence, that ghost had come roaring back. The Whitfield family received the call that night. Margaret, Sarah's mother, clutched the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. David, her father, stood in the doorway, silent, pale. The detective's words were cautious, careful. "We believe we found something. We can't confirm yet, but it may be her." Margaret wept. David simply whispered one word, "Finally." But the relief was tangled with horror. Because if it was Sarah, if the remains in that sealed room belonged to their daughter, then the nightmare was worse than they had ever imagined. For 34 years they had begged for answers. They had searched, hoped, and prayed. All along, Sarah had been here. Inside the hospital. Behind a wall. Forgotten. And so the question was no longer just, where had she gone? It was, how does someone vanish inside a hospital and stay hidden for 34 years? But to understand how this moment came to be, to understand how a young woman walked into a hospital for care and never walked out again, we need to go back. Back to the year 1990. Back to when the hospital was alive with voices, routines, and secrets. Back to the day Sarah Whitfield walked into its halls for the last time. The year was 1990. It was a year that felt caught between two worlds, the fading glow of the 1980s and the uncertain dawn of a new decade. Gas hovered just above $1 a gallon. Pretty Woman dominated the box office, with audiences flocking to theaters in droves. Families gathered in living rooms around bulky wooden televisions, twisting rabbit ear antennas to sharpen the picture. The Cold War had ended only months earlier, and people were adjusting to a new, strange sense of optimism. But inside the hospital on the edge of town, the world was different. It always had been. The hospital had stood for nearly 70 years by then. A massive, red brick structure with white stone trim, its silhouette loomed over the town like a watchtower. The original building, constructed in the 1920s, had been expanded again and again. Wing after wing sprouted over the decades, some modern and bright, others left to decay, their plaster walls buckling and their ceilings dripping from old pipes. By 1990, the place was a strange hybrid of eras. In one corridor, nurses pushed carts over gleaming tile beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. In another, a few steps away, the floorboards creaked, the walls smelled faintly of mildew, and shadows gathered in corners the lamps didn't quite reach. Doctors and nurses joked about it. Step from one hallway to the next, and you travel 30 years back in time. For patients, though, the building wasn't a joke. It was their whole world. The hospital mornings began early. At dawn, orderlies wheeled carts down the halls, the rattle of metal trays echoing like chains. The smell of coffee brewed in the break room mingled with the sharp tang of disinfectant. Radios played softly at the nurses' station, tuned to the top 40. Staff voices mixed with the hiss of oxygen tanks and the squeak of sneakers on linoleum. And in the psychiatric wing, the sounds were different still. The soft murmur of patients talking to themselves, the occasional cry out at night that echoed through the halls. Doors that clicked shut with a sound that was too final. This is where we meet Sarah Whitfield. Sarah was 27 years old in 1990, though people often mistook her for younger. She had wide brown eyes, dark hair that she kept in a loose braid, and a face that carried something both delicate and weary. She had grown up just a few towns over, in a small clapboard house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch swing. Her mother, Margaret, was a homemaker with a passion for gardening. Her father, David, worked long hours as a mechanic at the local garage. They were quiet people, hard-working, ordinary, with only one daughter, their Sarah. She had been, by all accounts, a gentle child, shy, a little withdrawn, but sweet. She loved birds, spent hours sketching them in pencil, copying their wings from guidebooks, or sitting on the back porch watching robins and sparrows flit through the garden. Neighbors remembered seeing her perched there for hours, lost in her drawings. But in her late teens, something began to shift. Sarah started struggling with bouts of depression, long stretches where she would barely leave her room. Then came periods of anxiety, where her thoughts spiraled, her hands trembled, and her heart raced without reason. Sometimes, she seemed distant, as if her mind was elsewhere entirely. Her family tried to help. They took her to doctors, they prayed, they told her it would pass, but by the time she reached her mid-20s, the episodes had grown worse. In 1989, after a particularly severe breakdown, Sarah was admitted to the hospital for extended psychiatric treatment. Back then, mental health carried a heavy stigma. People spoke of nerves or stress in hushed tones, avoiding the word psychiatric. Families kept it quiet, ashamed of how others might look at them. For the Whitfields, admitting Sarah was both a relief and a heartbreak. They wanted her safe. They wanted her stable. They hoped the hospital would provide structure, therapy, and maybe even healing. Sarah's care was overseen by a rotation of doctors and nurses. Some described her as polite, cooperative, almost painfully soft-spoken. Others noted her nervous habits, twirling a piece of string between her fingers, tapping her foot during group sessions. She rarely raised her voice. Sometimes, she smiled at things no one else saw. Her room was small and painted pale green, though the paint had faded into something more gray than soothing. She kept it neat. On the wall above her bed, she pinned one of her sketches, a robin perched on a branch, its wings mid-stretch. The edges of the paper curled, but she refused to take it down. Her possessions were modest: a paperback novel she read over and over, a wooden-handled comb, a rosary her grandmother had pressed into her palm years earlier, telling her, "This will keep you safe." Sarah held on to it always, the beads worn smooth by her touch. Her days followed a routine: breakfast at 7 o'clock, oatmeal, toast, sometimes eggs. At 9, group therapy sessions, where she mostly listened. Afternoons were filled with art classes, occupational therapy, or short walks in the courtyard when the weather was kind. Visitors came on weekends. Her parents tried to make the trip as often as they could, bringing flowers, clean clothes, and gentle reassurances that she was getting better. From the outside, it all seemed stable, mundane even, but stability was fragile in that place. The hospital was overcrowded. Nurses were stretched thin, sometimes working double shifts, doors jammed, alarms malfunctioned. Rumors circulated among patients of wings that had been shut down, places where no one went. Some whispered about doors that led to nowhere, hallways that had been bricked over. Most staff dismissed it as superstition, the kind of talk that spreads in institutions where boredom and fear mingle. But for Sarah and the other patients, the whispers felt real. At night, when the hospital grew quiet and the pipes groaned in the dark, those stories didn't feel like rumors. They felt like warnings. Still, Sarah remained hopeful. She wrote letters to her mother in careful handwriting, signing them with a small doodle of a bird in the corner. She told nurses she wanted to get better, that she wanted to feel steady, that she wanted to be seen. She followed the rules. She kept her head down. She caused no trouble. And yet, despite her gentleness, despite her quiet compliance, Sarah Whitfield would soon vanish inside those very walls. Her disappearance would not just devastate her family. It would shake the hospital, the police, and the entire town to its core. Because how does someone walk into a hospital seeking help and never come out again? That question hung in the air in 1990, and it would haunt everyone who knew her for the next 34 years. But to understand the weight of it, we need to look closely at the day Sarah disappeared. The last day anyone ever saw her alive. It was Thursday, April 12, 1990. The town woke that morning under a pale sky, the air just beginning to hint at spring. Daffodils pushed stubbornly through the soil in front yards, and the smell of rain lingered from a storm the night before. It was the kind of day where life seemed ordinary, routine, unremarkable. Inside the hospital, the day began like any other. The shift change happened at 6 o'clock sharp. Nurses in pale blue scrubs traded clipboards, passing updates in hushed tones. Carts rattled down the halls, carrying plastic cups of morning medications. The smell of disinfectant, sharp and chemical, mingled with the bitter aroma of coffee brewing in the staff lounge. Patients stirred awake as doors clicked open and footsteps moved between rooms. The fluorescent lights hummed to life, filling the corridors with a sterile glow. Sarah Whitfield was awake early, as she often was. A nurse later recalled seeing her sitting cross-legged on her bed at 6:30, her braid draped over one shoulder, twirling a bit of string between her fingers. She had a notebook open in her lap, though she wasn't writing, just staring at a half-finished sketch of a robin, shading the wing with tiny, deliberate strokes. At 7, she joined the others in the cafeteria. Breakfast that morning was scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice. The eggs were overcooked, rubbery, the kind patients pushed around their plates more than they ate. Sarah sat at her usual spot by the window, the weak sunlight falling across her face. She barely touched her eggs but drank all her juice. When she finished, she tucked the empty carton neatly under her tray, as though order itself was comforting. Staff who saw her at breakfast described her as quiet, calm, maybe a little distant. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. At 9 o'clock, Sarah attended her group therapy session. The notes from that day later became part of the investigation file. They described her as present, but minimally participatory. She nodded along when others spoke. She tapped her foot, a habit she often slipped into when her thoughts were restless. One counselor remembered her glancing repeatedly at the clock on the wall, though no one knew why. Afterward, Sarah returned to her room. She sat on her bed, notebook open again, pencil tapping against the page. At some point, she wrote a short entry in her journal, only a few sentences. "I want to feel steady. I want to feel seen." Those words would become haunting later, when investigators realized they were the last she ever wrote. At noon, she joined the others for lunch. Chicken casserole, a dinner roll, canned peaches. Sarah ate little, but she smiled faintly when a nurse admired the sparrow she had doodled on her napkin. That tiny smile would be the last expression anyone remembered clearly. The early afternoon passed quietly. Patients lingered in common areas, some watching television, others reading or napping. Staff rotated through, charting notes, escorting patients to short activities. Around 1 o'clock, Sarah was last seen in the hallway outside her room. An orderly recalled passing her as she walked slowly, twirling her string between her fingers. She looked thoughtful, he later said, like she was in her own world. Sometime between 1:30 and 2:15 in the afternoon, Sarah vanished. No one saw her leave, no alarms were triggered. Her room showed no sign of struggle. Her belongings were untouched, her comb still on the nightstand, her rosary resting neatly in the drawer, her paperback novel with a bookmark halfway through. It was as though she had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. At first, staff assumed she was wandering. It wasn't unusual for patients to drift into the wrong ward or slip outside into the garden. Nurses checked the cafeteria, the library, the courtyard. No Sarah. By 3 o'clock, unease was building. The PA system crackled to life. "Miss Whitfield, please return to the nurses' station." Silence. By 4, panic set in. Her parents were called. Margaret's voice on the phone, panicked, trembling, sharp with disbelief, burned into the nurse's memory. "What do you mean she's gone? She can't be gone. She's in a hospital." Staff searched every hallway, every stairwell, every locked closet. They checked the basement boiler room, the storage sheds outside. They even lifted ceiling tiles, peering into the shadows above. Nothing. By sundown, the police were on site. Detectives began interviewing staff, collecting the last accounts of Sarah's movements. They pieced together a timeline, but it ended in a void. One moment she was seen, and the next she was gone. The hospital was not equipped with surveillance cameras in 1990. Security was minimal. Doors were locked manually, logged on paper clipboards. The system relied on human eyes and human memory, both fragile, both fallible. That night, police expanded the search into the surrounding neighborhood. Officers knocked on doors, showing Sarah's photo, a young woman with soft brown eyes and a quiet smile. They asked if anyone had seen her walking, hitchhiking, boarding a bus. A few said they had. One woman swore she saw Sarah on Main Street, standing near the payphone outside the diner. Another claimed she boarded a northbound bus, but none of the sightings held up under scrutiny. The bus driver had no memory of her. The woman on Main Street had only caught a glimpse from across the street. By midnight, The search had turned up nothing but questions. Inside the hospital, Sarah's room sat untouched. The robin drawing she had pinned above her bed stared down at the emptiness. Her rosary glimmered faintly in the dim hall light. A nurse later said she paused in Sarah's doorway that night and felt a chill, as though the room itself knew she wasn't coming back. By morning, the nightmare had only deepened. The hospital administration held a tense meeting at dawn. They urged staff to keep calm, to continue routines, to reassure other patients. But behind closed doors, voices were raised, fingers pointed. How could this happen? Who had failed? Detectives pressed harder. They mapped the building, highlighting every exit. They questioned every staff member again, hoping someone had missed a detail, but nothing new surfaced. It was as if the walls themselves had swallowed Sarah whole. Her parents arrived again that day, exhausted, red-eyed, clinging to hope. They pleaded with the police, begged the staff for answers, but there were none. Margaret pressed Sarah's photo into the hands of an officer, whispering, "Don't forget her face." The days ahead would bring searches, rumors, theories, and heartache, but that Thursday, April 12, 1990, remained the day everything changed. The last day anyone saw Sarah Whitfield alive. The morning after Sarah Whitfield disappeared, the hospital was not the same place it had been only 24 hours earlier. Normally, the psychiatric wing followed a strict routine: breakfast at 7, group therapy at 9, activities in the afternoon, lights out at 10. But on that Friday, order had unraveled. Nurses moved briskly, whispering in clusters. Doctors shuffled between closed-door meetings, their faces pale and strained. Administrators huddled in an office upstairs, their voices sharp, their phones ringing off the hook. The unspoken truth was everywhere. A patient had vanished under their care. And not just any patient, a young woman whose parents had entrusted her safety to them. By dawn, detectives from the local police department were back on the ward. Their notebooks were open, their voices steady, but the tension was clear. They needed answers. The first step was retracing Sarah's last known movements. Detective Raymond Keller, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense manner, interviewed every staff member who had seen Sarah the day before. The counselor who had led her group session, the nurse who'd complimented her drawing at lunch, the orderly who swore he passed her in the hallway around 1:30. Each account was calm, ordinary, nothing that hinted at the horror to come. "She seemed fine," the counselor said. "Quiet, polite, nothing unusual," the nurse repeated. "She was just walking, twirling that little string she always carried," the orderly explained. Then, nothing. A blank space where Sarah should have been. Keller paced the hallway outside Sarah's room, his notebook open. The details were precise, the timeline tight, and yet, she was gone. The detectives searched her room again. They noted the robin drawing above her bed, the paperback novel with a bookmark resting neatly in the middle, the comb on the nightstand, and the rosary resting inside the drawer. The only unusual item was her journal, left open to the final entry. "I want to feel steady. I want to feel seen." Keller stared at those words for a long time. They weren't frantic. They weren't a goodbye. They were steady, deliberate, almost calm. That, he later admitted, unsettled him more than anything else. While detectives searched inside, the first wave of officers spread outside the hospital. They checked the grounds, bushes, parking lots, and maintenance sheds. Volunteers joined them, calling Sarah's name into the gray morning. But Sarah didn't answer. By mid-afternoon, word had spread. The local newspaper dispatched a reporter to the hospital. Television crews followed, their cameras perched on shoulders as anchors reported live from the front gates. Their microphones captured the fear in the voices of townspeople who gathered outside, whispering in disbelief. "She's inside that building somewhere," one woman said firmly. "People don't just disappear." Sarah's parents arrived around 3 o'clock, their faces drawn tight with fear and exhaustion. Margaret rushed into the hospital lobby, demanding answers, her voice breaking. David followed silently, one hand on his wife's shoulder, his eyes darting to every face as though one of them might have the answer. Detectives met them gently but directly. "We're doing everything we can," Keller assured them. "We've searched the grounds. We're interviewing staff. We'll find her." But the Whitfields were not reassured. "She wouldn't just leave," Margaret insisted. "She's not like that. She's gentle. She's shy. She wouldn't just walk away." The police widened their search. That evening, they knocked on doors in the surrounding neighborhood, showing Sarah's photo, a young woman with wide brown eyes and soft features, her braid draped neatly over one shoulder. One man thought he'd seen her walking along Main Street. Another swore she looked like the woman who had boarded a northbound bus earlier that afternoon. But when officers followed up, nothing panned out. The bus driver had no memory of her. The man on Main Street had only caught a glimpse across traffic. False hope, false leads. Back at the hospital, the search became more frantic. Every room was checked. Closets were opened, locked doors forced. Even the basement was scoured, the boiler room echoing with flashlight beams. One officer climbed into the ceiling crawlspace, his boots scraping against old pipes as he shined his light into dusty corners. Nothing. It was as though Sarah had been swallowed whole by the building. By nightfall, Margaret and David sat in the hospital's family waiting room, their hands clasped tightly together, staring at the door every time it opened. Margaret wept quietly, whispering her daughter's name like a prayer. David sat silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. At 11 o'clock that night, Keller called in more officers. They swept the nearby woods with flashlights, their beams bobbing like fireflies through the trees. They called Sarah's name into the darkness, their voices echoing off the branches. Still, nothing. By 2 in the morning, the search wound down. Officers returned empty-handed. Volunteers trickled home. The hospital fell quiet, its halls eerie and tense. But no one slept easily. The next day, the Whitfields brought a box of Sarah's belongings to the police station: photographs, letters, even her sketches of birds. Anything that might help jog a witness's memory. Margaret begged the detectives to look at the sketches, to see the kind of person Sarah was. She loved robins, she whispered, holding up one page where the bird perched on a branch, wings outstretched. She loved simple, gentle things. She would never just run off. She would never leave us. But the detectives had little to give in return. By the end of that week, Sarah's face appeared on missing person flyers taped to telephone poles, grocery store bulletin boards, and church doors. Her photo stared out from front pages with headlines that made the town shiver. Patient disappears inside hospital walls. Theories began to ripple through the community. Some insisted she had escaped deliberately. Others whispered that she had been abducted, even harmed, by someone inside the hospital. And darker still were those who claimed the hospital itself was to blame, that she had slipped into one of its forgotten wings, or worse, been hidden there. The police pressed on, but with each passing day, their leads grew colder. The Whitfields clung to hope, but even they could feel the shift, the way urgency was slowly giving way to uncertainty. And always, that same question lingered in every whispered conversation, every hushed rumor, every sleepless night. How does someone vanish inside a hospital? By the end of the second week of searching, the tone in town had shifted. At first there had been confidence. Surely the police would find Sarah. Surely she had just wandered off and would be spotted. Surely the hospital, a place built for safety, couldn't really lose someone inside its own walls. But as days passed with no trace, confidence curdled into unease. Unease hardened into fear. And fear, as it always does, began to feed on whispers. The hospital tried to maintain control. Press conferences were held. A spokesperson in a stiff gray suit repeated the same phrases again and again. "We are cooperating fully. We are doing everything we can. The safety of our patients is our highest priority." But the words rang hollow, because the truth was plain. A young woman had vanished from a locked psychiatric ward, and no one could explain how. The media seized on the strangeness. Local news stations led with the story night after night. Anchors stood outside the hospital gates, microphones trembling in the wind, their voices low with theatrical gravity. 27-year-old Sarah Whitfield disappeared from inside County General's psychiatric wing last Thursday. Despite extensive searches, no trace of her has been found. Headlines blared. Did patient vanish into thin air? Family demands answers after daughter disappears in hospital. Hospital with a haunted past? Reporters dug into the hospital's history. They wrote about the old psychiatric wings, about past lawsuits and accusations of mistreatment. They interviewed former employees who described overcrowding, broken equipment, and rumors of hidden wards. Suddenly, Sarah's case wasn't just a missing person story. It was a mystery and a scandal. And with that shift came a flood of speculation. Some townspeople believed Sarah had escaped deliberately. She didn't want to be there. one man told a reporter. She saw her chance and she took it. Others argued that she must have been abducted, perhaps by a staff member, perhaps by someone lurking near the grounds. But the most chilling theories were the ones tied to the hospital itself. The building had always been a source of unease in town. Teenagers dared one another to sneak in after dark. Parents told their children not to linger near its gates. People spoke of strange noises, of shadows in windows where no one should be. Now, with Sarah gone, those whispers grew louder. "It's the old wing," one woman insisted during a town meeting. "She's in there somewhere. They just don't want us to know." At the diner on Main Street, regulars leaned over their coffee cups and traded darker theories. Some swore that patients had been hidden away in secret wards, their existence scrubbed from records. Others whispered about tunnels running beneath the hospital, connecting to forgotten buildings. And in the psychiatric ward itself, patients began telling stories that unsettled even the staff. One man claimed he had seen Sarah after she disappeared, standing at the end of the hallway, her braids swinging as she turned a corner. Nurses checked. The hall was empty. Another patient insisted he heard someone crying at night in the walls. At first, staff dismissed it as delusion, but after several patients reported the same thing, even some nurses admitted unease. Whether the stories were hallucinations, echoes in old pipes, or something stranger, they spread quickly. And once the whispers took root, they could not be stopped. The police were flooded with tips. Some were absurd: sightings of Sarah in distant states, rumors she had joined a cult, even a claim that she had been abducted by aliens. Others seemed more credible but led nowhere. A woman in a diner who resembled her, a hitchhiker near the highway who matched her description. Psychics began calling the Whitfield family, offering visions and guidance. One said Sarah was near water. Another insisted she was underground. Margaret listened to each with trembling hands, desperate for anything. The police checked each lead. None held. Meanwhile, the family endured cruel speculation. Strangers suggested Sarah had staged her disappearance. Others whispered that the Whitfields must be hiding something. Margaret, once quiet and private, snapped at a reporter who pressed her too hard. "My daughter is missing, and you want a story. Well, she's not a story, she's my child." The longer the case went unsolved, the more it began to take on the shape of legend. At church, parishioners prayed for Sarah by name. In schools, children whispered about the girl who had vanished inside the hospital. Teenagers told ghost stories about her on sleepovers. "Don't look too long at the hospital at night. You might see her in the window, still waiting to be found." And in the hospital itself, the staff felt the weight of it every day. Nurses walked their rounds with unease, glancing at shadows in the corners. Some transferred out, unable to handle the scrutiny or the creeping sense that something was deeply wrong. The hospital administration fought to maintain order, but the whispers could not be silenced. They spread through the town, through the region, through every conversation that ended in a shiver. How does someone disappear inside a hospital? For Sarah's family, the rumors were salt in an open wound. They didn't want stories, they didn't want legends, they wanted Sarah. But as spring turned to summer, one truth became painfully clear. The search was stalling, the case was cooling, and the rumors were growing louder than the facts. Time has a strange way of stretching when you are waiting for someone who never comes home. In the first weeks after Sarah Whitfield vanished, the days had been frantic, filled with police knocking on doors, volunteers searching the woods, flyers plastered across every telephone pole in town. The Whitfields had barely slept. Margaret kept the phone clutched in her hand at all hours, terrified of missing a call. David paced the house in silence, his eyes fixed on the door, as if he could will Sarah to walk through it. But as weeks became months, the search grew quieter. The flyers faded, their corners curling in the rain. Headlines about Sarah disappeared from the front page, pushed aside by new crimes, new scandals, new tragedies. Police detectives, once calling the Whitfields daily, now updated them once a week, then once a month. Each call was shorter than the last. Each ended the same way: "We have nothing new." For Margaret and David, the silence was unbearable. They refused to let Sarah's memory slip away. They left the porch light on every night, a beacon for their daughter. Margaret made her bed each morning, as if Sarah might suddenly come home and crawl under the covers. David sat for hours in her room, flipping through her sketchbooks, running his hand over the spines of her books. Every year, on Sarah's birthday, Margaret baked a cake. At first, there were 28 candles. The next year, 29. The year after, 30. She made the same wish every year, her eyes closed, tears slipping down her cheeks. Bring her back to me. Neighbors tried to comfort them, bringing casseroles, offering prayers. Some were kind. Others avoided eye contact in the grocery store, as though Sarah's disappearance were contagious, as though grief itself might spread. The strain was heavy on the Whitfields' marriage. David grew more withdrawn, sinking into long silences. Margaret grew sharper, her grief cutting her words into knives. Friends whispered that they didn't know how the couple survived it. Many marriages didn't, but somehow, Margaret and David clung together, bound by loss. In 1995, hope flickered again. A woman in another state came forward, claiming to be Sarah. She looked like her same dark hair, same wide eyes. For a brief, dizzying moment, Margaret allowed herself to believe. But DNA testing proved otherwise. The woman was not their daughter. Margaret later described the moment as losing Sarah all over again. By the late 1990s, the case file had grown thick. Leads, tips, dead ends, false sightings, all stacked in binders that gathered dust in the police archives. Detectives retired, handing the case down to younger officers. Each new detective opened the file, frowned at the yellowed pages, and quietly set it aside. There was nothing new to chase. And so, the years stretched on. The hospital itself aged too. Its paint peeled, its ceilings sagged, entire wings were locked and forgotten. Staff rotated in and out, and with them came whispers about the girl who vanished. New nurses heard the story from veterans during night shifts, told in hushed tones. Some treated it like a ghost story. Others admitted it made the halls feel heavier, darker. By the early 2000s, Sarah's case had become legend in town. Teenagers whispered about her on sleepovers. Some dared each other to sneak onto the hospital grounds at night, swearing they could see her shadow in the windows. Local newspapers ran anniversary stories every few years, small blurbs tucked deep inside the paper. 10 years later, the mystery of missing patient endures. But for Margaret and David, Sarah was never a story. She was their daughter. They joined support groups for families of the missing, sitting in church basements with others who carried the same hollow ache. They shared their story, listened to others, and always left with the same feeling. The world kept moving, but for them, time was frozen on April 12, 1990. Margaret developed rituals to cope. She wrote Sarah letters she would never send, tucking them into a shoebox under her bed. She set a place for her at Christmas dinner, a silent reminder that the family was incomplete. She carried Sarah's rosary in her purse, fingering the beads during sleepless nights. David retreated into quiet routines. He walked the same path through town each evening, past the school, past the church, past the hospital gates. He never spoke about it, but neighbors noticed. It was as if he was keeping watch, as if he believed Sarah might still be somewhere behind those walls. The years wore on, hair turned gray, wrinkles deepened, friends passed away, but the Whitfields' grief remained, untouched by time. By 2010, 3 decades after Sarah vanished, many in town had stopped talking about her altogether. Younger generations barely knew her name. For them, the story of the girl who disappeared in the hospital was just a strange piece of local lore, like a campfire story told to spook one another. But the Whitfields never forgot. Even as their bodies weakened, even as hope seemed to fray, they held on to one truth. Someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to Sarah. And they were right. Because Sarah hadn't disappeared into the world. She hadn't run away. She hadn't been taken far. She had been in the hospital all along. Behind a sealed wall. Waiting. For 34 long years. To understand how someone could vanish inside a hospital, you first have to understand the hospital itself. The building had stood for nearly 100 years by the time Sarah Whitfield disappeared. Its red brick walls had watched generations pass through, mothers clutching newborns, children with broken arms, factory workers injured on the job. But it was not just a place of healing. Its history was tangled with shadows. The hospital was first built in the 1920s, at the height of the town's growth. The original building was small, only 3 floors, a few dozen beds, a single operating room. It was meant to serve a bustling but modest community. Over time, though, the town swelled, and with it, the hospital. Wing after wing was added, each stitched awkwardly to the last. The architecture was less a plan than a patchwork corridors that curved strangely, staircases that led to unexpected dead ends, doors that opened into forgotten closets. To walk the hospital was to wander a labyrinth, where old and new collided in uneasy silence. In the 1950s, the hospital expanded again, this time into psychiatric care. At the time, mental health treatment was primitive, even brutal. Patients were subjected to methods that sound barbaric now: insulin shock therapy, cold water baths, prolonged restraints. Electroshock was common. Families often brought loved ones in with hope, but too many never saw them come home again. The psychiatric wing developed a reputation. Nurses whispered of overcrowded wards where patients slept in hallways, of underpaid staff stretched thin, of treatments that did more harm than good. It was said that once admitted, some patients faded into the system, forgotten even by their own families. By the 1970s, lawsuits began to mount. Families complained of neglect, unsanitary conditions, even abuse. State inspectors issued damning reports. The hospital promised reforms, but change came slowly. The psychiatric wing remained a place most townspeople spoke of only in hushed tones. And then came the closures. In the late 70s and 80s, pressure from lawsuits and new regulations forced the hospital to shut down sections of the psychiatric wing. Officially, these closures were blamed on budget cuts and unsafe conditions. In reality, they were an attempt to bury the past. Entire hallways were emptied, their patients relocated, doors were locked, lights shut off. Some wings were bricked up entirely, as if erasing them from sight might erase what had happened there. But in the town, the stories never died. Teenagers dared one another to sneak into the shuttered wings. They spoke of padded rooms with peeling wallpaper, of rusted bed frames with restraints still dangling, of strange noises that echoed in the dark. Some swore they found tunnels beneath the hospital, hidden passages leading to other buildings. Whether those tunnels ever truly existed remains a matter of debate. To the public, the hospital became something more than a building. It was a character, a looming presence. People spoke of it the way others might speak of a haunted house, with unease, with suspicion, with the knowledge that it had seen too much. And when Sarah vanished in 1990, those old whispers came roaring back. Some said she had wandered into one of the sealed wings, trapped in a place no one checked. Others insisted she had been hidden there, deliberately. Still others whispered of darker things, of patients who had disappeared before, their names quietly erased from records. Inside the hospital, staff tried to dismiss these rumors, but even among them there was unease. One nurse, years later, admitted that the hospital's layout was a nightmare. You could walk through one door and end up in a corridor nobody had been in for years, she said. There were rooms without labels, locked doors with no keys. Sometimes we joked the hospital was alive, that it was hiding things from us. Another staff member recalled the fire marshal's inspection in the late 80s. He told us straight out, the man said, if you tried to evacuate this place in a fire, half the people would never make it out. Too many dead ends, too many locked wings, too many secrets. The hospital's reputation sank further as the years went on. Families grew wary of sending loved ones there. Some pulled patients out after Sarah's disappearance, afraid the same thing might happen again. Staff turnover skyrocketed. Those who stayed long-term admitted, in whispers, that the place never felt right again. By the time 3 decades had passed, the hospital was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of failure. Failure to care. Failure to protect. Failure to tell the truth. For the Whitfields, this history made their grief heavier. Each time they drove past the hospital, they wondered if Sarah was still in there, trapped in some forgotten hallway, locked behind some sealed door. And they were right. Because somewhere deep inside that maze of brick and plaster, behind walls bricked over in haste, Sarah Whitfield had been waiting all along. Her fate wasn't hidden in the world outside. It wasn't lost in the woods or along some distant highway. It was buried in the very building where she had once been promised safety. And when the walls finally came down in 2024, the hospital gave up its secret. But before we get there, before the sledgehammer struck plaster and exposed what had been concealed for decades, we need to step forward into the moment the past collided with the present. The renovations. By the spring of 2024, the hospital was only a shell of what it had once been. The psychiatric wing had long since been closed, its patients relocated to modern facilities across the county. The East Wing, once bustling with nurses, patients, and routines, now stood hollow, its wallpaper peeling like old bark, its ceilings sagging with water damage. The hospital board had finally approved its demolition, with promises of a gleaming new outpatient clinic in its place. For administrators, the project meant renewal. For construction crews, it meant just another contract, tearing down old walls, stripping wiring, hauling out debris. But for the town, watching the heavy machinery roll in stirred something else unease. The hospital was more than brick and mortar. It was part of the town's identity, its shadow etched into the skyline for nearly a century. Everyone had a story about it. A birth, a death, a surgery, a whispered memory of someone who never came home. And, of course, everyone remembered Sarah Whitfield. Some believed the demolition was long overdue. Others muttered that disturbing the building would stir up ghosts best left sleeping. For the workers, though, the hospital was simply a job site. They showed up each morning in hard hats and reflective vests, their radios blasting classic rock that echoed strangely in the cavernous halls. Dust clung to their clothes. Sledgehammers rang against plaster, dumpsters filled with rubble. But on one Tuesday morning in March, everything changed. A small crew was assigned to demolish a section of interior wall in the East Wing. The wall looked ordinary enough: cracked plaster, faded paint, water stains spreading like bruises. But when the first hammer struck, the sound was wrong. Hollow. The worker frowned. He hit again. The vibration echoed oddly, as though there was space on the other side. "Hey," he called, lowering his hammer. "Come listen to this." The others gathered, tapping the wall, knocking with their knuckles. Each blow answered with the same strange emptiness. The foreman, a stocky man with 30 years in construction, scowled. "That's not solid brick." He leaned in, brushing away plaster with his gloved hand. A faint outline appeared beneath the dust, straight lines, squared corners, the shape of a door. The crew fell silent. It wasn't on the blueprints. None of them had been told a door was there. The foreman cursed under his breath. Crowbar. It took several minutes to pry it open. The hinges groaned, rust screaming as the metal gave way. When the door finally cracked, the smell that poured out stopped everyone cold. It wasn't just dust and mildew. It was heavier, sour, clinging, the kind of smell that speaks of things left too long in the dark. One worker gagged, covering his mouth. Another muttered, "Christ Almighty." They raised their flashlights, beams slicing into the black. What they saw was a corridor. Narrow, windowless, lined with doors on both sides. The paint on the walls bubbled and peeled, curling like dried skin. A wheelchair sat crooked in the corner, one wheel bent. Clipboards still clung to hooks, their paper yellowed, their ink faded to ghosts of words. The silence was suffocating. The workers' boots echoed strangely, as though the hallway itself resisted being disturbed. They opened the first door. Inside, a bed frame, rusted, its leather restraints cracked and stiff. Another room, cabinets toppled, papers scattered, the faint outlines of medical charts scrawled in fading ink. On the walls, scratches shallow in some places, deep enough to expose brick in others. The men grew quieter with each step. Their earlier bravado was gone. At the end of the corridor was a heavier door, sealed with bolts on the outside. The foreman swallowed hard. "We've come this far," he said. His voice shook despite himself. They pried the bolts loose. The door groaned, protesting as it opened. Inside was a small patient room, bare, a metal bed frame against one wall, a folded hospital gown, a blanket. And in the corner, slumped against the plaster, were bones. The workers froze. Their flashlights trembled. One stepped back so quickly he tripped, crashing into the hallway wall. Another muttered a prayer under his breath. The foreman stood in the doorway, his face pale beneath the dust. "Call 911, he whispered. By the afternoon, the hospital was swarming. Police cruisers lined the street, red and blue lights flashing against the crumbling brick. Yellow crime scene tape wrapped around the East Wing, fluttering in the wind. Detectives in gloves and masks entered the corridor slowly, cameras flashing as they documented every inch. Reporters gathered outside the gates, microphones pressed forward. Rumors flew like sparks. That evening, the headline was everywhere. Human remains found behind sealed wall in abandoned hospital wing. For the town, the news hit like a lightning strike. Phones rang. Families gathered in living rooms, speaking in hushed voices. In diners and grocery store aisles, people leaned close to one another, whispering the same name: Sarah Whitfield. For more than 3 decades, her case had haunted the town, lingering like a ghost story. And now, here was a body inside the hospital, inside a place that should never have held secrets. Could it be her? For Margaret and David Whitfield, the call came that night. Margaret clutched the phone with trembling hands as the detective spoke carefully, cautiously. "We've found remains inside the hospital," he said. "We can't confirm yet, but there are personal items that match your daughter's." Margaret's knees buckled. David caught her, the phone pressed to his ear. He listened in silence, his eyes wet, his voice barely a whisper when he asked, "Is it her?" The detective hesitated. "We believe it may be, but we'll need DNA to confirm." Margaret wept until she couldn't breathe. David sat down slowly, his head in his hands. For them, the moment was unbearable. For 34 years, they had begged for answers, clung to hope, prayed for closure, and now that closure had arrived tangled with horror. Because if the body in that sealed room was Sarah's, then the nightmare was far worse than they had ever imagined. She hadn't run away. She hadn't been taken far. She hadn't vanished into the world. She had been here all along. Inside the hospital. Behind a wall. Forgotten. When detectives stepped into the sealed corridor for the first time, it felt less like entering a crime scene and more like walking into a tomb. The air was thick, almost oily, heavy with decades of dust and mildew. Even through masks, it stung the throat, clung to skin, settled into hair. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, beams sweeping across walls where paint had curled back in jagged strips. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been: the scuff of boots, the squeak of latex gloves, the click of a camera shutter. The hallway was silent, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed against you, as though the building itself were listening. The first thing they noticed was the design. The corridor was long and narrow, lined with a half-dozen doors. Each one was heavy, fitted with locks on the outside. That detail stopped them cold. These weren't patient rooms designed for comfort. They were cages. Room by room, investigators moved methodically, cataloging what time had preserved. The first room contained a rusted bed frame with leather restraints still dangling, stiff with age. The straps crumbled at the edges, brittle as parchment. On the wall above, deep scratches gouged into the plaster suggested someone had fought to get free. The second room held a toppled cabinet. Papers littered the floor, their ink faded almost to invisibility. Some charts were legible enough to read: patient names, dates, and treatments that had long since been banned: electroshock, insulin therapy, prolonged isolation. The third room contained nothing but a broken chair and a pile of blankets, eaten through by moths. But one investigator paused, shining his light across the wall. Dozens of tally marks were scratched there, uneven and jagged. Countless days marked in silence. Each room whispered the same truth. This place hadn't been abandoned by accident. It had been erased. And then came the final door. It was heavier than the others, bolted from the outside. The hinges shrieked as they forced it open, the sound echoing down the corridor. Inside, the room was bare. A metal bed frame against the wall, a folded hospital gown, a single blanket, placed neatly at the foot of the bed as if someone had once tried to keep order in chaos. And in the corner, the remains. The skeleton was slumped against the plaster, its posture frozen in eternal collapse. Bones fragile and pale, still wrapped in tatters of fabric that might once have been a hospital gown. Investigators stood in silence. One detective, a 20-year veteran, later admitted he whispered a prayer under his breath. Another paused at the doorway, unable to take another step. On the floor, beside the remains, lay a rosary. Its beads were tarnished, the chain rusted, but it was unmistakable. That rosary would be the first clue that linked the remains to Sarah Whitfield. Her family had always said she carried one, a gift from her grandmother. She held it when she was anxious. She kept it in her pocket, under her pillow, in her hand, at night. It was here, waiting beside her even in death. As forensic specialists carefully bagged the bones, one officer's flashlight caught something else: a notebook tucked into the seam of the mattress. The cover was brittle, the pages curled, but when they opened it, faint handwriting still covered the lines. The words were fragmented, uneven. Some were repeated again and again. "I want to go home. Please don't forget me." Other pages were filled with crude sketches of birds, robins, sparrows, wings mid-flight. The drawings were shaky, the lines sometimes smudged, but they were clearly hers. At the very end, the last pages carried shorter, weaker words. One read simply, "It's so quiet." Another, "I am still here." And the very last page bore a message that chilled every investigator who saw it. "I am not alone in here. 200. The handwriting was faint, uneven, the letters shaky as though written by a hand losing its strength. But they were legible. Who or what had she meant? The notebook was sealed in an evidence bag, but the words lingered in the minds of everyone who read them. The scene was documented inch by inch, every item photographed, every scrap of paper collected, every surface swabbed. Crime scene tape stretched across the sealed corridor, turning it from a forgotten wing into an active investigation. Outside, news crews camped by the gates, helicopters hovered overhead, the town buzzed with the story. And inside the Whitfield home, the phone rang. Margaret answered with trembling hands. The detective's voice was careful, deliberate. "We've found remains. We believe it may be Sarah. We need DNA to confirm." Margaret wept, the sound raw and broken. David stood beside her, silent, his face pale as chalk. For 34 years, they had lived with the unknown. Now, the truth was beginning to take shape. But it was a truth more terrible than they could have imagined. Sarah Whitfield hadn't disappeared into the world. She hadn't been taken far, hadn't slipped away into some new life. She had been here all along. Inside the hospital. Behind a door sealed from the outside. Waiting. And if the words in her notebook were to be believed, she hadn't been waiting alone. The remains from the sealed ward were transported under heavy guard to the county medical examiner's office. For the forensic team, the case was unlike anything they had handled before. This wasn't a fresh crime scene. It was a time capsule, a body locked away for decades, waiting to speak through the language of bones and dust. The medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Rourke, had worked cases of every kind: car accidents, homicides, unidentified remains found in rivers and fields. But when the evidence bags arrived from the hospital, she admitted feeling a chill she couldn't shake. It felt, she later said, like someone had been whispering from the grave for 30 years. The bones were laid out carefully, piece by piece, on a stainless steel table. Despite the years, the skeleton was nearly complete. The skull, the ribs, the long bones of the legs all intact, though fragile. The first conclusion came quickly: female. The second, approximate age, mid to late 20s. That matched Sarah Whitfield at the time of her disappearance. Dental records confirmed what the Whitfields already suspected in their hearts. The teeth aligned perfectly with Sarah's old dental charts. Still, the investigators pushed for absolute certainty. DNA was extracted from the bones and compared against swabs collected from Margaret and David. The match was conclusive. After 34 years, Sarah Whitfield had been found. But the question was no longer who. It was how. How had she died? The skeleton bore no signs of trauma, no knife marks etched into bone, no fractures from blunt force, no bullet holes. Forensic anthropologists looked closer. What they found was subtler, more devastating. The bones suggested prolonged malnutrition. The ribcage and pelvis bore the faint traces of wasting, as though her body had been starved over time. The notebook, with its desperate scrawls, "Please don't forget me," supported the same grim conclusion. Sarah hadn't been killed in an instant. She had been left. Trapped. Alone. Her body slowly failing as she waited for help that never came. Dr. Rourke examined the remains further. Based on the state of decomposition and the notebook entries, she estimated that Sarah had survived for days, perhaps even weeks, after being sealed inside that room. Her rosary beads, found beside her, suggested she prayed until the end. Her final words in the notebook, scrawled with a trembling hand, "I am not alone in here," left investigators unsettled. Was it hallucination, brought on by starvation and isolation? Or had she heard something, someone, in the darkness of that sealed ward? The room itself held answers too. Forensic teams scoured every inch. The blanket at the foot of the bed was folded, as though placed deliberately. That detail disturbed detectives. If Sarah had been abandoned by mistake, who had folded the blanket? Who had given her the notebook and pencil? Someone, at some point, had stepped into that room and seen her alive, and then left her there. The walls were examined. Behind the plaster, forensic engineers found layers of brick and mortar. Records suggested the ward had been officially closed in 1989, a year before Sarah vanished. But the construction of the sealed wall dated later, sometime in early 1990. Investigators traced through old hospital maintenance logs. Most were mundane notes about broken boilers, faulty wiring, leaky ceilings. But one entry stood out, dated April 15, 1990, only 3 days after Sarah vanished. In shaky handwriting, it read, "Final closure of annex complete, all doors sealed." The implication was horrifying. Sarah had been alive in that room when the ward was sealed. Detectives shifted their focus to the names in those maintenance logs. The foreman had died years earlier, but a handful of workers were still alive, now elderly. Interviews began. Most insisted they remembered nothing unusual. They said the wing had been condemned, that they were told it was empty. They claimed they simply followed orders. But one man, now in his 70s, broke down during questioning. His voice trembled as he described the memory that had haunted him for decades. "There was one door," he said quietly, "locked from the outside. We didn't have the key. The foreman told us to brick it over. Said it was unsafe, that it wasn't our concern. I didn't argue. I should have. God help me, I should have. His eyes filled with tears. "We never checked inside." The room fell silent. The truth was clear. Sarah hadn't run away. She hadn't been taken far. She hadn't disappeared into thin air. She had been locked in a forgotten ward, and in the rush to bury the hospital's past, someone had bricked her in. By accident, by negligence, or by design. Investigators couldn't yet say which. But they knew one thing for certain. Sarah Whitfield had been failed by the system, by the hospital, and by the people who sealed those walls without asking questions. For Margaret and David, the medical examiner's report was unbearable. Margaret wept until she collapsed, whispering, "She was right there. All these years, she was right there." David sat silently, staring at the rosary beads that had been returned to them in a plastic evidence bag. He held them in his palm, his thumb rubbing over the tarnished metal, and for the first time in years, he cried openly. The town, too, reeled. Newspapers ran front-page spreads. National outlets picked up the story. Sealed alive, hospital's dark secret. Talk shows debated how such a tragedy could happen in modern America. And through it all, one question grew louder. If Sarah had been bricked into that room in 1990, then someone had known. Someone had ordered it. Someone had carried it out. And someone had walked away. By the summer of 2024, the investigation into Sarah Whitfield's death had shifted from bones and notebooks to paper trails and accountability. The forensics had answered the most painful question. Yes, the remains were Sarah's. But they had also opened a darker mystery. Sarah hadn't been killed by force. She hadn't been shot or stabbed or strangled. She had been sealed inside a hospital room and left there to die. And that begged the question. Who knew? Detectives pored over archives, requesting every scrap of hospital documentation from the 1980s and 90s. Boxes of files were pulled from dusty county storage, their labels fading, their folders swollen with age. Many records were missing, lost in floods or shredded during past renovations. But in the fragments that remained, patterns began to emerge. A memo from 1989 referenced the closure of East Psychiatric Annex, effective immediately. Another, dated March of 1990, instructed maintenance staff to secure all doors, ensure access is restricted, and report completion to administration. The language was bureaucratic, cold, but behind the phrasing, detectives saw the outline of the truth. The East Wing hadn't just been closed, it had been buried. Former employees were tracked down. Some were in their 80s now, their memories softened by time. They recalled lawsuits, inspections, whispers of mistreatment. They spoke of administrators who wanted the psychiatric wing out of sight, out of mind. Most claimed ignorance about the sealed corridor. "We were told it was condemned," one said. "Unsafe, that was all." But others admitted there were places they avoided. "There were doors we didn't open," a retired nurse said, her voice trembling. "We were told not to ask questions. I always wondered what was behind them." Slowly, the picture sharpened. The East Annex, the corridor where Sarah had been found, was once used for long-term psychiatric patients. These were the people considered difficult, untreatable, or simply too inconvenient for their families to manage. In the 1970s, that ward had been overcrowded, unsanitary, notorious for complaints. By the late 70s, inspectors cited the hospital repeatedly. In 1978, the state ordered reforms. The easiest solution for administrators wasn't to improve the wing, but to shut it down quietly. Patients were shuffled elsewhere, staff reassigned, doors locked. By the mid-80s, the wing was officially decommissioned. Blueprints no longer showed its existence. In public records, it simply vanished. But behind the walls, it remained. And in 1990, someone made the choice to brick it up for good. The most damning evidence came from the maintenance logbook recovered in archives. On April 15, 1993, days after Sarah disappeared, an entry read, "Final closure of annex complete, all doors sealed." The handwriting belonged to a foreman who had since passed away, but under his name were signatures of workers who had carried out the job. Detectives interviewed them one by one. Most repeated the same story. They were told to seal the wing, that it was empty, that the doors were condemned. They claimed they never saw Sarah. But one man, the same worker who had cracked years later, admitted the truth that had haunted him for decades. "There was one door," he said, his voice shaking. "Locked from the outside. We didn't have the key," the foreman said. "Brick it over. It's not our concern." I remember standing there, thinking, shouldn't we check? But I didn't argue. We just did it. We bricked it shut. His words chilled the detectives. Sarah had been inside that room, alive, while workers sealed the door forever. Whether they truly believed the wing was empty or whether they suspected and ignored their doubts, the result was the same. Sarah had been erased. Attention then turned to the hospital administration of that era. The hospital board chairman in 1990 was long deceased. Several department heads had also passed. Others were elderly, in their 90s, their memories fragile. Some gave interviews, but their words danced around responsibility. "It was a different time," one administrator said. "Resources were tight. The state was breathing down our necks. We did what we had to." But when pressed about Sarah's disappearance, he faltered. "That poor girl," he muttered. "That should never have happened." The implication was clear. People had known more than they ever admitted. The Whitfield family demanded justice. Margaret stood before reporters, her voice cracking as she held up Sarah's photograph. "They left my daughter in there. They sealed her in like she was nothing. And then they let us suffer for 34 years. Somebody has to answer for that." But justice, in a legal sense, was out of reach. Most of the key decision-makers were dead. Statutes of limitation on negligence had long since expired. Prosecutors admitted there was little chance of a trial. And yet, in the court of public opinion, the verdict was clear. The hospital had failed. The administrators had failed. The workers had failed. Every person who signed a piece of paper, followed an order without question, or chose silence over action had failed Sarah Whitfield. The town reeled with anger. Protests broke out outside the hospital gates. Signs read, "Justice for Sarah," and "No more secrets." Former patients came forward with their own stories of neglect, of fear, of being ignored. Some claimed that Sarah wasn't the only one lost in those walls. And though no charges would ever stick, the weight of truth itself became its own form of punishment. Because the story wasn't about a girl who simply vanished anymore. It was about how a system, built to heal, could abandon someone so completely that she was bricked behind a wall and forgotten. Sarah Whitfield's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was an indictment. When the DNA results came back, there was no more doubt. The bones in the sealed ward belonged to Sarah Whitfield. After 34 years, the mystery that had haunted her family, her community, and the hospital itself finally had an answer. But answers are not the same as peace. For Margaret and David Whitfield, the confirmation was both a blessing and a curse. They had spent more than half their lives waiting for news, clinging to the hope that Sarah was alive somewhere. Now, at last, they knew. But knowing meant confronting the unbearable truth. Sarah had died alone, just a few walls away from where they had once visited her, praying she was safe. Margaret's hands shook when detectives placed a small plastic evidence bag on her kitchen table. Inside was Sarah's rosary, tarnished, fragile, but unmistakably hers. Margaret cradled it in her palms as though it were a living thing. "She held this," she whispered. "She held this until the end." David sat beside her, silent. He had grown frail in recent years, his once strong hands now thin and trembling. He rubbed his thumb over the beads and let the tears come freely, his shoulders shaking with the grief of decades unleashed. The hospital issued a formal apology. Administrators in pressed suits stood stiff behind microphones, offering deep regret and sincere condolences. They promised reforms, audits, transparency. But for many, the words rang hollow. No apology could undo what had been done. For the town, the discovery reopened old wounds. In June of 2024, Sarah was laid to rest. The church overflowed with mourners, family, neighbors, townspeople who had never forgotten her name. Even strangers came, people who had followed her case for years in headlines and whispers. Sarah's coffin, draped in white flowers, sat at the front of the sanctuary. Beside it, Margaret had arranged Sarah's robin sketches, saved all these years. One drawing of a bird mid-flight was placed in a frame beside her photograph. Margaret, her voice trembling, read a passage from Sarah's journal. "I want to feel steady. I want to feel seen." She looked out at the congregation, her eyes wet but fierce. "Now, at last," she said, "my daughter is seen." David stood in silence, his hand resting on the casket. He whispered something only he and Sarah would ever know. The funeral was not only for Sarah. It was for every parent who had ever feared losing a child, for every patient who had ever been silenced in that hospital, for every person who carried the weight of unanswered questions. The town mourned, but it also seethed. Outside the hospital gates, protesters gathered, demanding accountability. Former patients told stories of neglect and cruelty. Families of the forgotten came forward, asking whether their loved ones, too, had been hidden away. The hospital board scrambled to contain the fallout, but the damage was done. Its reputation was shattered. For some, Sarah's discovery became a rallying cry. Advocates for mental health reform used her story to push for stronger oversight, more transparency, more compassion. Her name appeared in editorials, in speeches, in vigils. But for the Whitfields, the noise of protest and politics was distant. Their grief was private, unrelenting. Margaret returned to her rituals. She baked a cake on Sarah's birthday, but this time she set it beside the rosary and the bird sketches, whispering her wish into the silence. "You are home now." David, weakened by age, continued his evening walks past the hospital gates. He no longer looked for Sarah in the windows. Instead, he bowed his head, as though in prayer, as though speaking to her spirit in the bricks. Closure had come, but it was jagged. Because while the town now knew Sarah's fate, questions remained unanswered. The notebook, retrieved from her room, had been catalogued as evidence. Most of its pages were filled with fragmented thoughts. "Please don't forget me. I want to go home. Why is it so quiet?" But the last page was different. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, as though written by a hand weakened by hunger and exhaustion. But the words were clear. "I am not alone in here." Investigators could never explain it. No other remains were found in the ward. No records suggested another patient had been left behind. Some believed it was a hallucination, the result of isolation and starvation. Others whispered that perhaps Sarah had heard footsteps, voices, the sound of someone moving on the other side of the wall. Whatever the truth, the words lingered. Margaret kept the notebook in a glass case on her mantel. Sometimes, she sat in her living room late at night, reading the pages, her fingers hovering just above the faded ink. She said it made her feel closer to Sarah, even as it chilled her to imagine what her daughter endured. The town, too, carried the haunting echo of that final line, "I am not alone in here." It became part of Sarah's story, passed on in whispers, retold in living rooms and classrooms and campfires. Some said she had meant it literally. Others believed it was metaphor, that even as she died in silence, she knew she carried the love of her family with her. But no one could deny the weight of the words. Sarah Whitfield had vanished in 1990. She had been hidden in plain sight for 34 years. And when the truth finally came out, it revealed not only her suffering, but the failures of an entire system meant to protect her. The hospital walls came down, but her story remained. And in that story was a reminder, chilling and unshakable. Some walls don't just hide secrets, they bury them.